I started thinking about gender and negotiation. I took negotiation my first year of law school. And like Donna, I've loved negotiation since the moment I got exposed to it. I took it first year. I don't know if you recall your first year of law school and how totally uplifting that is, right? Like, I don't know about. I was not a star student my first year of law school and felt like I was getting beaten over the head most of the time. And negotiation was this shining light, the best grade. That also helps. And I loved it. It was fascinating, interesting, interdisciplinary. I'm learning psych and history and poli-sci and all of this as part of how people behave to one another. But about 2/3 through, we had this thing, Gender Day. It was awesome, right? So you guys can figure out the math of how long ago that was. So yes, it was a long time ago, but not so long enough ago that you'd think that there was still a thing called Gender Day. And it was a whole day devoted to like how women negotiate, which led me to two questions. A, so what have I been learning for the first 2/3 of the class, and does it not apply to me? I'm confused. And B, the advice seemed like garbage because most of it was focused on how women are overly cooperative and overly nice and need to assert themselves, and delivered by women in blouses with giant bows. That was the style back then, and I'm like, A, I'm never dressing like that. No. And B, there was nobody in my family I'd ever met who was not assertive. And to this, and I can now say this, 30 years later, you could ask any male in my family, right? Dad, husband, brother, son. There's nobody who thinks that the women in my family need to be more assertive, right? That's the lacking skill set in our family dynamics. If only the women were more dominating and gave their opinions more often, right? Not a thing in my family. So when I was in class and I'm sitting here and listening to all of this advice, I was really angry, and also really curious, like, who in the world does this apply to? Because I've never met these people. I really didn't know who they were talking about. So fast forward, got into law school teaching, started to meet some of the people for whom that was the family dynamic or how they were socialized or concerns that they had as I became a teacher and was working with them. And so the first thing I did upon getting tenure, right, so you write the law review articles with a gabillion footnotes that nobody's ever going to read, that's fine. Thank you all for editing those, right, and your law reviews. It's lovely. Did a study of how lawyers negotiate. There was an original study done in the 1970s by Jerry Williams looking at the populations in Phoenix and Denver, but there were so few women that they couldn't even draw any conclusions about whether men and women negotiated differently on behalf of clients. So I decided, this was now 99 and into 2000, did a study of lawyers in Milwaukee and Chicago trying to figure out a whole host of things, one of which was to then look to see if there were any gender differences. And there weren't. There just absolutely weren't in how they were perceived, in their styles, in rated effectiveness, in any statistically significant way. There were no difference. It was what in psychology and empirical work we would say a null finding, right? We didn't find anything. So I said, look, see, women equal, done, same, bye, and put it away. like, okay, now let's get back to like solving the international conflicts of the world, right? We can so do that in our free time, so let's do that and drop the gender stuff for a while. But then in the mid-2000s, we had a series of books and studies that came out all around the idea that either women don't ask, which was a very famous book looking from some experiments that I'll talk about. And then we had Lean In, both of which seem to basically say that if there's a pay equity difference, it comes from women not asking enough, that they're not leaning in, that all we need to do is to enable women to be more confident, to ask more in negotiation, and magically everything will be equal. Well, this infuriated me yet again. And since most of my gender research tends to be from a place of anger, it's not healthy, but it is it's motivating. So dove back in to talk about that. That led to the TED Talk. I'll go into some of that research on women don't negotiate and other similar nonsense because as I'm sure you have now figured out, that's garbage, right? There's a lot of structural reasons why there's pay inequity and a lot of other inequalities, and it has very little to do with the fact that we are not sufficiently talkative or asking or confident or, all of those things. So we'll go back into that. So again, put it away. I'm good with that. But then you'll note the other picture. These are my sons, their album cover. This is this is them goofing off after the youngest's bar mitzvah. So we have all of the official photos, looking all proper, and then they go into the parking lot and they look like idiots, which is, there's no frontal lobe. Of course they're idiots, and we love them. That's exactly, I love them all. This is about 8 years ago. But in the meantime, how am I doing all of this research on telling women what they can do in negotiation and how to improve? And do I really not have good advice for my sons? And do I not have good advice for half of my class? Because yes, of course, 50% of law school are women, 50% are men. Is there no research out there telling us what men need to work on in terms of their skill set to be a more effective negotiator? So I dove back in to all of this research, and that's been the last 2.5, 3 years of research, bringing together all sorts of studies in related areas that talk about the broad set of skills. So that's how I got here. As we're getting started, I want you to reflect to yourself what you think your strongest negotiation skill is and what you think your weakest is. So I don't know about you, I ended up at law school because I was listing out all of the reasons why my curfew should be extended, right? Like, here are the top 10 reasons why this is unfair, and really 1 o'clock is fine. And my mom said, please go to law school and get paid for that. So I think usually the willingness to ask is one of mine. On the other hand, if we were listing weaknesses, maybe the listening thing sometimes, not such a skill set, right? So are there other things in reflecting on your own skill set where people have told you, oh, you're really good at this, you get where people are coming from, or you're really creative, or whatever it is. So I want you to reflect to yourself on both of those. And as we're diving in, I want us to recognize that we're focusing on gender because we can. There are a ton of studies out there. Everybody is captivated by studying gender differences. And here's the thing, maybe that's what explains your skill set, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's only a small piece of what determines how you communicate to the rest of the world. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have studies in a whole host of other areas which perhaps could explain or do an equally good job of understanding where our skills come from. So, right, family. We've just described my family dynamic, probably too much. If you ever meet my kids, if you're hanging out at Madison, which is where they are, right, say hi, you'll see them. We'll talk about them some more, right? Your family dynamic obviously has something to do with this. Were you a family that was really comfortable arguing, contradicting your parents? Is that part of how you were raised, or you don't discuss conflict? Right? Oh, no. Either parents always knew what was going on, or you'd mutter under your breath and you'd move on, and Thanksgiving is a very quiet in your house. Right? I train my students to go home and be able to have those challenging conversations at Thanksgiving, right? How do you tell your uncle they're a bonehead? Right? It's an important skill set. Just saying, we've all been there, right? At those lovely meals, and you're like, really? Right? Families have different dynamics. That obviously impacts whether we're willing to ask for things, willing to have conflicts, willing to actually engage, so on and so forth. Right? Birth order, a huge determining factor. Right? All sorts of studies about how the oldest behaves, the middle child, right? Supposedly more of a mediator, the youngest one. So the youngest one who was doing this, right? If you now met him, he's a freshman at the University of Wisconsin, and he was obnoxious to you when you were negotiating, and I can assure you he probably would be. Adorable and charming in every way, and obnoxious. Okay, so is he obnoxious with you because he's a white kid? Is he obnoxious because he's a guy? Is he obnoxious because he's privileged and his parents are lawyers and he's been raised to argue like nobody's business? Is he obnoxious because he's the third of 3 boys, and if he didn't run faster, punch harder, go down, whatever sport faster than them, he wasn't going to get fed and he wasn't going to get respect? So he's been raised in this soup of, I've got to be really competitive. Because that's the only way, right? At least now he's taller than them, which is, of course, hugely satisfying, right? We told him to be patient, like it will all come back, right? But for years, right, he got pinned and sat on and everything else. all the important things that older brothers do to younger brothers, right? That no doubt has much more to do with how he's coming across in a negotiation, and yet we tend to focus on what we can see. So we can see gender. And when we negotiate, we say, oh, right, is he competitive because he's a guy? Or because of race or something I can see? Because we're usually not interviewing to say, so your birth order. Tell me about this. Your family dynamics. Let's just discuss before we sit down and have a negotiation. How did that really impact you, right? Or ethnicity, the part of the country that you grew up in, right? We hear in Milwaukee, we hear a lot about like Milwaukee nice or Minnesota nice, right? We have a political candidate talking about that. Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, I'm totally happy that everybody's nice in Wisconsin. You know, when there's a sign that there's construction 2 miles down the road, everybody gets over. Well, I was raised on the East Coast. Thank you for getting out of my way, because I'm staying in that lane until the last possible moment. I don't know where you people learn to drive. I am going right down there. Thank you very much, right? So that might, too, have something to do with how we negotiate. We don't interview people on all of that. So this is all a huge caveat in terms of we're talking about gender because we can, because we've got the studies. But if it doesn't fit for you, fine. And frankly, if it angers you, if there's something that I say that you disagree with, that you, this doesn't apply to me, good. That's the same thing that made me want to do this, right, and dive into this. So if you're finding part of this doesn't fit, fight it. Question it. Think about how it would apply to somebody else you've met, or maybe you're somewhere else on the bell curve. Any of these studies that we're talking about give us the average, right? Again, we're not interviewing people. So on the bell curve of that, you know, an ethic of care that women have, where are you? Again, we don't know that. We make all sorts of assumptions. Maybe they're accurate and maybe they're not. So as we dive into this, right, I'm talking men and women because it's faster than saying masculine and feminine, right? The studies will go back and forth on their use of all of these things. So I want to caveat on that. The studies often don't distinguish as to whether this is biological or socialized. Most of this is socialization. There's not biologic underpinnings except when I talk about hormonal differences. But the rest of this is really all through socialization, and so something to recognize as well. And as we get into the research, I'm going to point out some stuff that's more historic that may or may not apply anymore versus what's really the new research coming out there and how we're asking questions. So with all of that, what we're going to do for the rest of our time together is basically have a framework that looks at 5 negotiation skills. And for each of these, I'm going to explain a little bit about the skill, some of which you have already been educated in ADR or negotiation. You'll recognize some of these. When time, we're going to do a little bit of an exercise just to have some fun with this. And then we'll talk about what the gender research is that we have. And again, maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't. Wherever you find yourself on the bell curve, it's interesting to highlight what are the skills that people are stronger or weaker on wherever you are, so that it's helpful to identify what you need to work on in terms of being more effective. All right, so first thing we're going to do. I want you to hold hands with the person next to you. And Professor Szastowski, can I borrow you up here? So what I want you to do, so here is the hardest part of this exercise, which is no talking. So just one of you. I love this, that you guys have like a group hug going on back there. No, just one of you. Pick one partner, just one partner. All right, so everybody get a partner. All right, and you're holding hands with your partner. You might need to clear a little space on the table. So you get a point every time you touch your partner's hand to the table, or the spatial equivalent thereof, right? I get it might be into space. There might not be the table on both sides. I love this, somebody moving around so that, right, find someone you can hold hands with. All right, so you get a point every time you touch your partner's hand. Your partner gets a point every time she touches your hand to the table or spatial equivalent thereof. Okay, all right, you have all of 10 seconds. On your mark, no talking. On your mark, get set, go. All right, freeze. Shake out your arms. I know, little afternoon exercise. Everybody waking up? Excellent. All right, how many of you had no points? No points. Excellent, no points. How many of you 1 to 5? 6 to 10? Above 10? Above 15? Anybody above 15? All right, let me go back to the I got no points here. Right, oh, I like that. In the back. What's your name?
Jackie.
All right, Jackie, what were you thinking going into this?
I need to work out more.
Yeah, I know. It's really nasty not to have warned you in advance and, let you lift weights this morning, do a little stretching beforehand. So, yes, I need to work out more. All right, who else had no points? Yes, tell me your name. Yes?
Naomi.
Sorry?
Naomi.
All right, Naomi, what are you thinking?
I don't really care if I win or lose.
I don't care. All right. Also a reason we think about this. Excellent. Not that important to me. Not anything I'm staying up with tonight. Great. All right. What else? Who else? Yes, you. I know you didn't. What's your name?
I'm Tori.
All right, Tori.
I was going for I didn't want to have a point against me, so at all costs, we kept it in the middle.
So we kept right. I don't want to lose.
Yeah, I don't want to lose.
Right. I actually don't want to lose. I don't want to. Right. So I need to work out. I don't want to lose. I don't really care. Right. All of this. What are we assuming a win is based on here? Upper body strength, right? You're like upper body strength, of which I am seriously lacking. Yes, okay. And those of you who got, where am I? You guys in the back got a lot of points? Yeah, what were you thinking here? We get a lot of, if we cooperate, we get a lot of points. And what were you guys, right, and you're both buff, so you're like, yeah, we could take each other down, but, right, we're going to actually, so you guys are flipping back and forth as fast as possible, right? So some people are flipping back and forth, right? All of this goes toward how we think about the interaction, right? If it's based on physical strength, then we're like, oh, I should have worked out. Oh, that would be good, right? If I don't feel so strong, I don't really care, right? I'm not going to be good at it. I'm going to disengage. And at the very least, I don't want to lose, right? It's this very competitive set. So what were the signals that this was not an exercise in which I really was interested on your upper body strength? Hint. Yes. Goal is to get as many points as possible. Do you care about the other person's points? No. Okay. Structure is different. Wait, by the way, why did we assume it was based on upper body strength? Again, tell me your name. Jackie.
The pain in my elbow when I was losing. I wish I could have fought.
Did you used to do this when you were younger, by any chance? Whatever. Arm wrestling?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So how many of us arm wrestled, as children or last week? I mean, you don't have to tell me when you last did this, right? It's on ESPN in the afternoon, right? It's either poker or this when there's literally nothing else on, right? So this is a sport. We see it. We've done this as kids. It's competitive, one and done with a little bit of trash talking. Very important. Okay, right? We even see it on commercials to demonstrate not only physical prowess, but intelligence, right? All of these things. All right, so the goal is different. What else was different here? Yes?
No talking.
No talking, right? It totally undercuts your ability to trash talk your friends. It's very frustrating, right? Because beforehand, one of my students was doing an internship in Vegas for MMA, and so when I was out there giving a talk, I went to see the weigh-in, talk about trash talking, right? Like the weigh-in where you're officially getting weighed before the fight is a small piece of what is an entire lead-up 2 days of basically trash talking, of oh, you're going down in flame, it's not Muhammad Ali anymore, right? That was actual poetry. This is just, bad trash talking. So you can't talk. Very frustrating. What else is different? What did I call the person you were doing this with? Partner. What were you doing when I set you up? What did I call it? You were, who was it? Partnering. You were finding a partner. What were you doing with your partner? Holding hands. And where are we? Is this gym class in 5th grade? Right? Also no, right? I didn't line you up by height, we, remember 5th grade fond gym memories of trying to match you with somebody who is equal to your physical strength, right? So our context is different. The language is different. The goal is different. And yet for most of us, we go default. right? Oh, I arm wrestled as a kid, and despite the fact that I didn't lift today, I am holding hands with my partner in a session on negotiation. I'm going to try to crush you like a bug and be really frustrated that I can't tell you I'm going to do that. Okay, this is part of what happens in negotiation with one skill in particular. Let me just finish this with arm wrestling, right? We tend to assume the worst. We tend to assume that the pie is going to be shrunk, that there's going to be less for me, that we can't work together. We tend to wait for a signal. So maybe one of you figured out like, oh, I could go back and forth, but you're like making the like death stare to your partner there and they're not picking it up, right? Like, hello, hey, bonehead, right? No, right? You miss the communication. All of these things happen. And where this ties in is really the skill set of ethicality, which is all about trust, reputation, working with the other side, and it's really how we go into negotiation in terms of what is our reputation, what do people expect, so that if you knew the person here who you were dealing with, or when you know the lawyer on the other side, right, studies have shown that even when two lawyers went to court, didn't settle, the next time around, they're more likely to settle because they know each other. Right? No matter what the reputation is, at least they know each other. They're more willing to work together, right? That reputational value. And this is really important in a negotiation for gathering information from the other side, right? And, of course, having them trust you, being willing to work out an agreement, right? All of those things that we talk about in terms of building trust and working on your reputation. So we can do all sorts of things in terms of building trust to figure out what people know, what's our reputation, what their reputation is, are there typical customs, do they have a reputation at their firm for only making an offer on the courtroom stairs, or now we know that we can go back and forth and negotiate a little farther in advance, right? All of these things are things we want to be thinking about in negotiation as we're interacting with the other side. And of course, you're trying to figure out their own character, their beliefs, how do they work together in smaller legal communities. And frankly, even I gave this talk once in Beijing, and I had a lawyer come up afterwards and said, oh, I'm really concerned about, lying, deception, I'm really careful. And I'm like, what? I'm like, you're in a city of 20 million people. He's like, oh, everybody knows everybody. Like, it gets around in a minute. And I'm like, okay, so in Beijing, you are worried about your legal reputation. I would challenge any of us in any size town here in the United States, right? If they're worried in Beijing, we should be worried here, right? We can research their firm, their behavior, and of course know that oftentimes that reputation is almost a halo effect. My husband's a lawyer in town as well. He's in-house at a company, and he's been a Little League coach for the twerps that you saw for forever, right? And it's always fun when people are like, oh, he's such a good coach. I assume that means he's a really good lawyer, right? Those things have nothing to do with one another, right? As a skill set, like the patience to tell the kid how to hold the bat, I'm going to go with, yes, maybe patience and mentoring, but your legal skills, and yet all of that, right? Your reputation in one area halos over to other areas all the time. And so it's not just can you research how they negotiated that last case? What do people know about them in the community, right? Using our networks to really find out whether or not we can trust them. What we also know is when you build those connections and when you highlight those connections to your counterpart, they're much less likely to deceive you as well. Because now they know that like your second cousin's brother, once removed friend, right neighbor, happens to know you. And even that is a good defensive move as we're thinking about negotiation. So now we're going to do trust falls. No, kidding. We are not going to stand up and do trust falls. So what do we know about the gender differences? So interestingly, women are considered to have higher standards and are both seen as having higher ethical standards and are also punished for violating those ethical standards. So let me explain a little bit more about this. Women are seen to be more ethical in all sorts of surveys, that they're going to be following along, they're going to be protecting their client. This is an advantage, of course. If you're seen as more trustworthy, people are going to give you more information. And that's a wonderful thing, right? It's easier to build rapport, gather all that information in a negotiation, and so we want to take advantage of that. On the other hand, you're also more likely to be lied to. And so you're going to gather more information, and you should check it, right? Trust and verify all of that. Kind of interesting studies as well. All right. Another interesting thing about women is that they are also measured as what we would call engaging in pro-social enforcement of norms, aka gossip, right? And it enforces behavior. You want to take advantage of those networks. If you have information about who knows what about this lawyer in town, this person, the boss that you're going to be working for, Medium Men was a list of people you wanted to avoid, shall we say, right, of bad things that were happening, all of that can be really useful. So you want to take advantage of the networks, of the ability to share that if women are more willing to have that information out there, that again is something you want to take advantage of. On the other hand, right, if you're falling in the category of where people are more likely to be suspicious of you, you need to work on that reputation. You need to make it an explicit part of your strategy to build trust and to demonstrate that you are worthy of sharing information with, right? That how are you going to exchange that? So you want to think about that dialogue of back and forth information more carefully to demonstrate that you will both receive and give information as well. And if you have this reputation or people are more suspicious of you, then you end up with less integrative agreements. Again, if you're trying to find out that sweet spot for both their client and your client, you need that additional information and trust. So something to be careful about. Also, what we know in terms of ethics is what, again, the studies have shown this thing called ego depletion, that you need control in order to stay ethical. That, you know, if you're making, for either gender, making decisions at the end of the day when somebody's been yelling at you and you're cranky and you know you got to run home and so on and so forth, we are less likely to bring our best selves and to think carefully about ethical decisions. Something to be aware of both in yourself and your counterpart, right? It's very interesting how we think in, you know, mediation and people, you get the whole long day and then we're trying to push people towards settlement, right? That's also potentially the time where there's a lot of ego depletion and people are going to say stuff just to get it done, right? So it's also something to be careful about. Some of the studies, and we'll circle back to this later as well, also talk about of testosterone versus oxytocin when they have done studies of negotiating pairs. So oxytocin, when women are negotiating, and even in a prisoner's dilemma situation, right, the arm wrestling, can we work together versus is it more for me or less for you? When women cooperate, oxytocin goes up, and that's the happy hormone. Right, I'm like, oh, yay, we're working together. This is awesome. Let's keep going back and forth. Flip, 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 flip. Right, this is great. For guys, the hormone at play, and again, biologically, everybody's all over the bell curve, and I haven't tested anybody here. So, right, we don't know who this applies to or not. But what we do know is that higher levels of testosterone lead to higher levels of risk-taking. And so they've done fun studies, mostly in stock market crashes in the UK, tracking traders who get themselves into trouble. Right, so they're doing well, and it's amazing, and all the testosterone surges, and then they take risks. And the whole thing comes crashing and burning down, right? Problematic there. Actually, right, if you want your money invested more safely, there's a whole line of research out there now, mostly coming out of Great Britain, saying that women traders are much calmer over the course of the day. So it's totally a lot of fun to be able to say men are really hormonal. It's really sad, and they have to track their hormones more carefully in order to not make terrible decisions, particularly by the end of the day. Again, maybe it's applying to you or maybe not, but it's a little fun to be thinking about how that impacts our ethical decision making as well. All right, so that is our first skill. Second skill is something called social intuition, which comes out of the field of emotional intelligence, social intelligence, behavioral economics, right? All of the fun studies that have been looking at how people interact in a room, how they understand each other, how they can work together, reading the nonverbal cues, paraverbal cues, and this is really three different parts, right? The first is, do you know yourself, right? When you're holding your hand like this, right? Does that sound, I'm captivated. Wow, this is great. Or it's, oh my God, I'm so bored. I have to hold up my head, right? Right? Or if I go like this in a negotiation, what does this mean? Sorry?
You're over. It's done.
I'm over with you. I am so over, all right? Right? I'm going to cross my hands. What else? Sorry? Right, so I'm wary, right? I'm being protective. I'm defensive. Absolutely.
It usually means I'm cold.
Exactly. Right? You cross your arms because you're cold. Now, if you're aware of how that actually comes across, which is skeptical, defensive, I'm done, right? You're also going to go like this. Right? Totally minor signal. You don't even have to say a word. Right? But everybody gets that the crossing arms is because you're cold and not because you're annoyed or defensive. Right? And part of that is, do you know yourself? Are you reading the body language, the signals that you are sending out? Right? When you start talking really fast about something, is that because you're super excited and, oh my God, I can't believe you offered me that. Yeah, this is great. Or, oh Lord, I've actually lied and I really don't want you to ask me any questions, so I'm going to talk right over you. Who knows, right? Or is it like you've looked at the clock and you're like, oh, I got to get going, right? Being aware of yourself, really, really important. How do we read the other side? So can we recognize their body language when they're leaning in, leaning back, standing close to us, their pace, their tone, all of those things? And then what's our skill for bridging it? Right? So there's some great studies out there that, sit the way that they sit, talk at the pace that they talk at the pace at. And we as animals, basically, biological beings, often do this unconsciously. Right? If you're talking to someone from the South, and I had two Southern roommates in college, Memphis and Jacksonville, which, as we know, Northern Florida is actually the South, while Southern Florida is the North, right? So she's from Northern Florida, which makes her a Southerner. It took me a while to get there, but I did, right? And I would come home saying, y'all, to my Pittsburgh family who thought I was crazy, right? But we all do that kind of unconsciously. We'll start mimicking the accent, the pace, the tone. And part of the skill in negotiation is to get good at doing that consciously, because it's making people comfortable. So you want to think about all of this. How close do we stand? Do we mirror them? Our eye contact, right? And that too these are all cultural, I should point out. Right, so the studies that are done are very much done in the United States, right, and really useful for us to think about. Right, as Donna mentioned, I've been working a lot in the area of sciences. So when we talk about eye contact, right, if you're the chair of a department who's been raised in the United States, you've been raised that eye contact is trust. Right, this is how we build rapport. People use eye contact to convey information. It's really, really important. What if you're negotiating with someone who has been trained that making eye contact with someone who is superior to them in position or experience or rank is seen as challenging or disrespectful? So they don't make eye contact with you because that is an appropriate cultural thing that they have been raised with. And then, of course, the chair thinks, well, because they're lying to me, or because they don't trust me, or because they don't want to work with me, right? And so you have to be aware of how all of these play out culturally as well. All sorts of studies have shown that women are better at this in a variety of ways, and I will dig into that. So when we look at facial expressions, smiles, eye contact, mood, tone, pretty much across the board, women are measured better at decoding this, figuring out nonverbal displays, all of the different things that, again, this is a skill set of, can you literally read the room? Can you read the situation? Do you know what's going on? And are you picking up those cues in a way that can be very helpful in terms of building that rapport and figuring out what's going on in the negotiation, right? Clearly tying to effectiveness. We also know that in terms of self-control, right, being aware of yourself, right? I want to get really excited. That's an amazing offer. And I actually don't want to tell them that it's an amazing offer because I would like to continue to negotiate, right? Takes a little bit of control, a little bit of awareness of like, okay, right, instead of talking really fast because, oh my God, I can't believe they offered me so much money, this is the most amazing thing ever, I am actually not going to say that. I'm going to say something to the effect of, wow, thank you very much. I would like to understand a little bit more about how this is based on, because apparently whatever standards I was using, I was undercutting myself. So I'm totally surprised by that. Let me continue to negotiate and get more information from them, right? That actually takes a little bit of self-control and awareness. And we understand that that is part of managing yourself in a negotiation. Final piece on this in terms of mood is, again, this goes towards socialization, where if you've been trained to host of either gender, then you're paying attention to everything, to the temperature in the room, right? Let's not freeze people out as a general rule, right? Like, do we need munchies? Great studies out there showing us that people in happier moods come to more integrative agreements. So have Hershey's Kisses available when you're negotiating, or making sure that people are happily fed, well rested, making jokes. All of those things, again, make you more effective in a negotiation. On the converse, what we know is when you don't have this, you need to be trained at it in order to become more effective negotiators. And so here's some really interesting thing coming out of the hostage negotiation team training for both alpha men and alpha women. Right? By the time you are available, or eligible, I should say, to apply to be on the NYPD hostage negotiation team, you've had at least 10 years on the beat, right? You've been a cop, you have probably advanced to be a detective, you have plenty of alpha skills, right? You are physically fit, you know how to use all of your weapons, and you've been really good at it. So the hostage negotiation training mostly focuses on the rest of the skill set. How do I listen? How do I read body language? How do I understand the tone of someone who's behind the door holding the kid hostage, or about to jump off the bridge, or whatever it is? And how do I read that situation? That's where most of the training is focused on, because if you're now going to start interacting with people where you are using your words versus using your weapons, you're going to need a broader skill set. And so what we know is, that's where these trainings are mostly focusing on. Men are better able to read threat, period. Okay, really useful in one set of contexts, and maybe not so useful, again, when you are negotiating, right? Is every counteroffer a threat? Right? Well, if you read it that way, it will be. And so how do we damp that down a little bit? Mood. So some interesting things in terms of setting the mood, and really in terms of making people aware of what expectations are. We'll talk later about assertiveness and some of the fear that women face backlash. What we also know is that men face backlash, right? Years of having anti-bullying campaigns in grade schools and middle schools and everything has had an impact in which there's a backlash for anybody being aggressive, obnoxious, right? In a negotiation, they're going to be, well, not treated well, right? For anybody, and there's some fun studies looking at salary negotiations, that if you respond to a salary offer saying, oh, this is terrible, this is awful, I could never work for this company, I could never work for this law firm, this is so disrespectful. Okay, not surprisingly, you come across like a jerk. And people are not willing to hire you of either gender. This was some of the work that my very first study did looking at how lawyers negotiate. And my stepdad is in business, and I was explaining this to him, and he's like, so you need empirical proof to demonstrate what every business person in the country already knows? Like, we don't sell things if we're jerks to people? I'm like, yes, we actually need empirical proof for that, Dad. It's like, oh, you're such a geek, right? You're such a law professor. Why do you need proof? This is good common sense. And of course it is common sense and backed up by research that shows you're not going to get things by bullying people. And for men, particularly those who are taller, bigger, so on and so forth, right? Advice would be you should be aware of how you're coming across. Right? If you are 6'5" and you're standing over someone who is much smaller than them at a desk, sit down. I mean, unless your intent is to be threatening, right? You want to do that, knock yourself out, but make sure it's intentional, right? Don't by accident put somebody on the defensive when you're not intending to do that. And so being aware of how that comes across, everything from tone, size, standing up, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's not only the interaction between the genders, but in studies, again, looking at male pairs, anger is the most common emotion, which is, again, problematic. Angry people don't give you goodies. Right? If you're negotiating for goodies, and that is why you were negotiating, right? If you could do it yourself, you would. Right? So you're negotiating because they have something you want, or because you want that behavior to change, or whatever it is. Angry people are not going to give you stuff. So you need to do that as well. All right. Last thing about social intuition is touch. So don't touch anybody, ever. Don't. Just don't. And you know, there's all sorts of fun messages about that now. So being really super clear, don't ever touch anybody. And in a business context, the appropriate touch is a handshake. And it is worth it. It is valuable for everyone, either gender, to engage in that. And here is why. Touch builds rapport. So you want to engage in that. It's a fun little creepy study here about waitstaff. Waitstaff, when returning a check, if they touch somebody on the shoulder as they were returning the bill, just like that, right, or touch somebody's hand, they got higher tips. Totally creepy. And really interesting, right, of that even a short, small touch builds rapport. So in a business context, you do want to shake hands, right? Double hand, elbow hand, bro hug, whatever it is, you want to have that touch. And in mixed gender pairs, the women are going to be the one determining the touch. Right? You know somebody, you haven't seen them for a while, it's going to be the women who are leaning in for the hug or, right, the double hand, whatever it is. That too is effective, useful rapport building. So don't just dismiss it out of hand. Figure out how you're going to greet that person and be conscious about the ability there to build rapport by doing that. Third skill is flexibility. Both thinking about the variety of different outcomes that we can achieve in a negotiation, as well as having different processes, different ways that we can get something done. And the short answer with flexibility is that there's very little gender difference out there. In terms of more creative or less creative, there's arguably different pathways to creativity, but even some of this is a little bit, well, not repeated and not proven. So process flexibility is just understanding that there's more than one style to get things done. So you might approach somebody collaboratively, but then you're going to want to be a little bit more assertive on something. You want to cave in on something else and be more accommodating. And all of that is the ability, again, to be aware of what's working. It is social intuition that helps you figure out which approach is going to be most effective. And so you want to have that in your negotiation wheelhouse, as it were. And then, of course, there's outcome flexibility, right? Understanding that there's a variety of different ways to get something done. So just to give us a quick shot of some outcome flexibility, I want you to we'll do this actually as a group. How would you improve the shopping cart? Just shout it out. What are different ways, different things? Here's the lovely shopping cart. I am sure we have all had a lot of fun with this. How would you improve it? Cup holder. What else?
Bag hooks.
Bag hooks, great. Yes, that's why we get married. Right? Right? Someone else can do this. Look, or we call Peapod and they just show up with our food. Yes. So somebody else to do this. What else? Right. So no more ankle bites. Exactly. What else? Okay, so we could divide. Exactly. What else?
Something so that it doesn't shock you. Sometimes you touch it.
Oh, yeah, the winter, yes, you get that nice shock thing when you touch it. Right, the whole metal conduction thing. All right, good. Yes?
An insulated area for frozen food.
Okay, so when we get our our parts, can we actually separate it out? Did you ever notice how, like, fruits and vegetables are the first thing in? So you're like, yes, let me put my peaches at the bottom of the cart. Like, who thought of that, right? It's like, but if there were separate spaces, you could actually protect your fragile goods, right? So on and so forth. So if we had a ton of time, we would continue brainstorming, but you could already see kind of what are our interests here. By the way, this is a shopping cart up by me, Fresh Market. Those little things come out. So you can even, like, reverse them. Once you fill it, you could put the bottom one on top, so on and so forth. Separate, and it's really nice and small, and the wheels go in both directions, right? I didn't hear a lot on the wheels, right? But we might go through and then think about, all right, even before we evaluate whether or not we can do this, we can make it happen, this is part of the brainstorming process that, frankly, gives me some ideas on what's important to you, right? For you in the back, what's your name? Andrea. Right, you clearly don't want to do this. right? What is important to me is not the cart. What is important to me is not doing it. And here, let me sell you a membership in like a delivery system, right? That's going to be my customer that I'm not going to bother with like nice music and carpeting. I'm just going to try to get him in and out, deliver the food as fast as possible, right? You wanted a cup holder, right? Well, you know, and if we actually gave you some sample coffee as you were starting to shop, right? How many of you have gone to Costco? Not only do you spend, of course, more money than you ever expect, but like, go on sample day, right? Like, oh my God, you're buying all that stuff, right? And it's lovely and it's nice. I've gone on Super Bowl Sunday, by the way. That's really good. Like samples everywhere. You can come home full and of course, having spent all of your money, but it's a pro and con there, right? So in that brainstorming, I'm getting some insight into what's important to you, right? I'm asking questions, I'm gathering information, and that's something that we can use in a negotiation as well, whether it's in preparation or with the other side. So what we know is that for flexibility, to find different ways of getting things done, we need time and we need information. We also need connections and people to ask in order to gather that. And while we don't have differences really in terms of creativity, what we might have are differences in terms of willingness to ask. So how many of you guys know Carol Gilligan's story, right? Sort of, kind of. All right, I'm going to tell it super fast. Back in the psychological literature in the 1970s, there was a little scenario where a husband and wife, the wife is sick and the husband is faced with a choice to steal the drug from the pharmacy or not, right? And they surveyed a whole bunch of 11 and 12-year-old boys. The boys, signified by Jake, says that, well, life is worth more than stealing, so I'm going to steal because it's to save a life. And the girls, represented by Amy, fights the hypo. Says, all right, well, this is stupid. This is stupid on several levels. First of all, can't we talk to the pharmacist? I'm sure the pharmacist doesn't want the wife to die either. Like, why do we have to steal? Can't we work out a payment plan? Isn't there another way that we can work this through? And by the way, when the husband steals and then gets arrested, who's taking care of the sick wife? This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? So she fights the hypo. Now, back in the day, this was considered that she cared more, right? But one could also read this as a flexibility story of saying, I don't like this. I'm coming up with a variety of different ways to get it done. And in that, as a flexibility, as a problem-solving story, that, of course, is a great impulse. Now, this is not a license that all of you should now start telling your professors on final exams, I'm going to fight the hypo, and here's why. You asked a terrible question, and let me tell you that. Please do not risk your grade with a fight the hypo answer. That is, right? That's not my advice. In negotiation, totally fight the hypo, right? If you're given a this or that and you don't like either of them, figure out a third way. And that's the kind of flexibility that makes you a more effective negotiator. On the other hand, if you're making decisions quickly without consulting and without getting a lot of information, then perhaps you are making it fast, but it's not the best decision. It's not the most Pareto optimal. It's not the most flexible. And so Jake, we might read as we're going to steal because that makes sense right now, but the consequences down the road don't make a lot of sense. And again, in those testosterone studies that show that they're making really fast decisions without thinking through the consequences. And again, that's not so helpful in terms of being careful and therefore being really flexible, right? Flexibility requires that information gathering, a lot of that consult before deciding, talking to a lot of different people, even polling people on what makes sense for a shopping cart, right? That actually takes a little bit of time. Okay, fourth skill, empathy. We talk a lot about this in negotiation. This has been highlighted since the early 90s as a really important negotiation skill. Both cognitively, can I understand where they're coming from in terms of perspective taking? Do I see cognitively where they are? And then emotionally, can I also understand where they're coming from? What do they think? Their view of you. Active listening we talk about, inquiring, gathering information are all of these very important pieces of negotiation. And we spend a lot of time talking about perceptions, partisan perceptions, ladder of inference, all sorts of tools. So we, of course, at the bottom, experience different data. We reason from that differently. We come to different conclusions. And in negotiation, we spend a ton of time telling you to be at the bottom here. right? Thinking carefully about what are the experiences that each party has, what are they bringing that to the table, and trying to distinguish that from our conclusions, right? That we're not jumping to conclusions, we're really trying to not necessarily agree with the other party, but just understand them, right? Do I get where they are coming from? And so a very important skill in negotiation. The other view of this is something called the ladder of inference, where again, everything that we see and experience is down on the bottom, and then of course we pull different conclusions from it. Politics is often a great example of this. Back in the day, your grandparents would all watch Walter Cronkite. At least we were all watching the same news, and then you would have different conclusions about what the policies are. You can imagine now we're not even watching the same news or reading the same newspaper or following the same Twitter feed, and so no surprise that the conclusions by the time you get to the top of the ladder are very different. Right? The only way that you can really get over this is to ask questions and understand and listen. We're going to skip right over this. Fun thing in terms of attention. Well, I don't know if you can see it, but up at the top there, there's this little monkey all the way in the lung scan. And so one of the things that actually happens, yeah, like top. So my top right, over there, right? So I know this looks like a little alien here, like Happy Halloween, right? It's actually a lung scan. And radiologists looking for deformities in the lungs totally miss the elephant. They miss the little ape there because they are looking for other particular anomalies. This happens in negotiation all the time, where we are looking for something in particular, we ignore all of the other information that's going on around us. And so when we're selecting different data, it tends to be confirming data. It's already fitting the story of what we tell ourselves in terms of that party, that other side, whatever it is, right? Very important skills in terms of how we really understand what's going on in negotiation. This was me driving to the airport. I don't know about you. I am an excellent driver. Everybody else around me is a hazard. Oh, and by the way, like if I speed, first of all, I'm a really good driver. And second of all, I'm totally justified. Okay, because I'm running late for something, or it's very important that I get there, or my appointment is earlier, whatever it is, right? If you speed, it is a character flaw, and you are a hazard to everyone around you. Get off the road, right? Okay, this is what we do in negotiation all the time. We also assume that any mistake that I make is a one-off, context-based, and totally excusable. When you make a mistake, it happens all the time. It's a sign of your character, and I never want to deal with you again. Makes negotiation more challenging. So what we know in terms of empathy is that, again, women are rated more highly, whether it's seen in this ethic of care, whether or not you believe that, listening, and in terms of flattery. So we worry in that ethic of care that women can be taken advantage of, and something to consider. That's one of the stereotypes, whether or not that actually applies. Second piece of this is that women are often measured as better listeners, and that they're more likely to ask questions, easier to engage in active listening, tell me what you mean by this, and that, of course, is how we can gather more information. And the last piece of this, which is kind of interesting in terms of empathizing with the other side, is that women often use flattery, and frankly, we're more able to do so. So my husband, as I said, is in-house counsel, supervises a whole bunch of lawyers. He never says anything about what they are wearing, ever. And that is a really good thing, right? I mean, A, he doesn't notice half of it, because that's him. And B, he's never commenting, like maybe a haircut. That seems to be safe, right? A new pair of glasses, maybe, right? On the other hand, right, women are socialized to select, oh, what a cute cap. I really like that design, right? And the earrings are totally, right? We are always pointing out like what people are wearing, how they're looking, new shoes, new clothes, new hair, new this. They're more likely to chat about their kids, their families. All of those things have been measured in terms of communication topics. And the fact of the matter is that, too, is empathizing and building rapport. You're more likely to put someone at ease, get more information from them, even when they know that you're flattering them, right? Even if they know you're using it, it works. It's magic, right? It's totally magic potion. And women women can be doing this, right? In this day and age, men stick to my husband's rule of, you can't say anything even when you may or may not notice anything, right? It's, again, one of those socialized things. And it can be an advantage in terms of establishing empathy in the negotiation. Men, on the other hand, are often measured as needing work on this, and so better listeners are better liked. This is from a fun speed dating study, so take this for what it is worth. The people who were most successful at speed dating were not spending the 5 minutes talking about themselves, preening why they are awesome and you should go out with them, but rather were the people who asked questions about the person across the table. So there's your dating advice for you. And what we know is that clients want better listeners, right? Clients want you to be asking questions and to find out what's really important. So when we're talking about problem-solving negotiation or interest-based negotiation, right, working with your clients, working with your counterpart, all of that takes a certain amount of questions to find out the information. And so we know that that's really crucial. The other piece of this is that good listening, really listening carefully, is the only thing that changes people's minds. And these studies are out of Israel and Palestine, places where it's really hard to change people's minds, right? We're not talking about, like, are the restaurants in Sacramento better than Davis, right? I'm going to assume that if you tried that often enough, you might have an opinion. So people in deep conflict need really careful listening skills. And that's, of course, potentially where you will be as well, representing your clients. So you need those listening skills. Conversely, right, all of the business books say that leaders need to be empathetic, resonant leadership, leading with integrity, so on and so forth. There's all sorts of great literature out there that talks about the skill set of listening and active listening and empathy for leadership, and yet it's not at all socially rewarded until you magically graduate, and then you better have it. In some ways, it's not fair. And so to really think about what are the classes, much like NYPD hostage negotiation training, right? What are the classes, what are the skills that we really want to build on to make sure that we have those in our back pocket as well, that we're able to do that. Last skill that we have to talk about is assertiveness. The importance of asking for what you want, the knowledge to go ahead and prep your case, to know your client, so on and so forth, and then presentation. Right? It doesn't matter how brilliant you are if you are silent. You actually have to say something, ask for it in order to get it. Knowledge. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly given our time. So aspirations, really important in terms of setting high aspirations. You're never going to get more than what you ask for, so goals are really important in terms of negotiation. You want them to be optimistic, specific, and justifiable, and negotiators oftentimes don't do this because they're either scared or they don't have information or they don't care, which is fine when you don't care. Right? On the other hand, if you do, you want to make sure that you have the information and knowledge necessary to set those high goals. Presentation is the counterpart of this, that you actually have to be able to talk about negotiation in order to do better and to get what you want. The ladder of inference you can also flip in terms of how you speak. So let me talk about what I experienced. Here's my experience at the bottom of the ladder. Then here's my reasoning. Here's why I think X, Y, and Z. And here is my conclusion on it. Right, so you're doing a better job of explaining your thinking rather than talking at the top of the ladder. Also, other pieces of fun advice, things that we don't want to do. So not long enough, obviously, but just to give you a little bit of a feel of the difference when we speak using but versus and. Right? But tends to put people on defensive. So no matter what the original idea was, you're on the defensive, you're trying to explain why your idea is terrific or whatever it is, and you're less likely to share another idea. You have no doubt been in student org meetings where somebody comes up with an idea and somebody else says, oh, that's a terrible idea, that will never work, or we did that 5 years ago, or that's going to be too expensive, or that's dumb, or whatever it is, and who's going to be the next person to raise their hand? Nobody does that. Right? Because it's a but. It shuts you down. If you actually want somebody to engage and continue to listen to you, right? Because now you're trying to assert, you have to engage them in a way that reduces their defensiveness and allows them to continue to listen to you. And that is an and. Right? So this comes from improv. right? You take wherever they are as a given, and then you're building and. And I want us to consider this. And here's what's also important, right? And. And so those are all the skills in terms of thinking about how we are assertive. So, women often are told that they need to ask for more. This is where we started, that they need higher confidence and that they need to set higher goals. And some of this comes from this research, the historic research, that women don't ask. So let's dig into what that research is. Linda Babcock wrote this book in the mid-2000s after noting that many of her graduate students didn't negotiate their salary upon graduation. She also ran an experiment where students were called into a lab and played Boggle, and then were offered an amount of money. Men in this, when they were offered an amount of money, would then counter and say, but I did really well, I want more, right? Instead of $3, I want $7, I deserve $10, and would say, pay me more. Women would say things like, well, how did you decide how much money you get? And what's the standard here? And, oh, I thought I would get more for this, right? And so they're not countering, they're talking around it. That wasn't counted as negotiation. Even though what we know is based on every other skill that we've talked about, that might be the more effective way of getting money out of somebody. But in this one-shot interaction in a lab, that's not what it was considered. Luckily for us, that's not actually where we work, right? Person we're never going to see ever again testing us on Boggle. I mean, unless you really like Boggle, and that's what you want to do, right? The fact of the matter is that women tend to negotiate over more. So then not only salary, but kind of what are the work conditions, your vacation pay, time off, bonuses, reviews, so on and so forth. In more recent studies looking at across the board, this was out of Australia in 2013 and 2014, the rate of negotiation, in other words, whether men and women would negotiate, had no difference whatsoever across tens of thousands of people. And even when Linda Babcock started to train her graduate students, they negotiated at the same rate. In my studies of law students upon graduation, there was no difference between men and women in terms of negotiating their own salary. Right? We self-select into advocacy training. We know we're supposed to negotiate, and so that rate of negotiation is the same, as is the amount of money that men and women received as well. What we do know is that women have lower confidence in adolescence. I don't know if you remember 8th grade fondly ever for anybody, right? It is terrible for everyone. And so when you measure women's rate of confidence, and again, this is in the United States, so very socialized, it doesn't pick back up into the late 20s. Well, if you're doing all of your studies on negotiation on 18-year-olds in Psych 101 classes or 23-year-olds, it's going to be lower. That doesn't actually tell us about how women in their 30s and 40s should negotiate their salary. Right? It just doesn't apply. And so we want to be really careful when we're looking at that. Sometimes we found that women don't ask for enough and don't set high enough goals. And again, this can be the networking piece of this, that women don't yet have enough networks in the company, right? If you're the first woman hired here, nobody's there telling you, like, here are the things you can negotiate for, and here's how much you can ask for, and things like that. And so definitely continuing to push in terms of setting your goals, really, really important. On the other hand, men tend toward overconfidence, right? All of those, the first 2/3 of my negotiation class back in the day that talked about negotiation error, there is error, mostly for men who are overconfident, and then when they're overconfident, this is a typical error, it escalates the negotiation, and it is highly problematic. As we've also talked about, men face an equal backlash for bullying. So for both men and women, the lesson is don't be a jerk. Not surprising, right? We don't really need empirical evidence for this, but in fact, men can face an even greater backlash. So as we are wrapping up, I want you guys to be thinking about for yourself the advantages and disadvantages, right, of each thing that you bring to the table, your strongest and weakest skills. Where are they coming from? Right, that knowledge of, oh, I sound exactly like my mom, which, by the way, is petrifying at any age. I get that. And, right, let's identify what are you bringing to the table, because then you'll understand how you can change, how you can add on to that, where are the skills you have and where are you lacking and what do you want to build into that. We want to understand that gender, yes, it is studied, it is studied, it is studied, and it is just one lens of where our negotiation skills come from, right? And so also for any researchers, feel free to study other things. We're looking at that. Assertiveness, which tends to be the focus of so many of our negotiation studies, is just one skill. There are so many things that are out there that make you an effective negotiator, and there's a real need for studying more than opening bid or high offer or whatever it is, and we're not doing that. So we tend to focus too much on assertiveness, and the best negotiators are really the ones that bring a variety of skills to the table. As you are going out there and you want to be effective on behalf of yourself or your client, you want to be thinking about all of these in terms of making yourself more effective. And our last thing, a couple articles, books, things I'm happy to talk with anybody in terms of providing sources. And with that, I'm going to close it.